Chapter 8, Part 2 of Miss Mapp. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rhonda Fetterman. Miss Mapp by E. F. Benson. Chapter 8, Part 2. Miss Mapp let herself into her house in an agony of mortification. She could scarcely realize that her little expedition, undertaken with so much ardent and earnest curiosity only a quarter of an hour ago, had ended in so deplorable a surfeit of sensation. She had gone out in obedience to an innocent and indeed laudable desire to ascertain how Major Benjy spent those evenings on which he had deceived her into imagining that, owing to her influence, he had gone ever so early to bed, only to find that he sat up ever so late, and that she was fettered by a promise not to breathe to a soul a single word about the depravity of Captain Puffin, on pain of being herself accused, out of the mouth of two witnesses, of being equally depraved herself. More wounding yet was the part played by her Major Benjy in these odious transactions, and it was only possible to conclude that he put a higher value on his fellowship with his degraded friend than on chivalry itself. And what did his silence imply? Probably it was a defensive one. He imagined that he too would be included in the stories that Miss Mapp proposed to sow broadcast upon the fruitful fields of Tilling, and indeed when she called to mind his bellowing about worm-casts, his general instability of speech and equilibrium, she told herself that he had ample cause for such a supposition. He, when his lights were out, was abetting, assisting, and perhaps joining Captain Puffin. When his window was alight on alternate nights, she made no doubt now that Captain Puffin was performing a similar role. This had been going on for weeks under her very nose, without her having the smallest suspicion of it. Humiliated by all that had happened, and flattened in her own estimation by the sense of her blindness, she penetrated to the kitchen and lit a gas ring to make herself some hot cocoa, which would at least comfort her physical chatterings. There was a letter for Withers slipped sideways into its envelope on the kitchen table, and mechanically she opened it and read it by the bluish flame of the burner. She had always suspected Withers of having a young man, and here was proof of it. But that he should be Mr. Hopkins of the fish shop! There is known to medical science a pleasant device known as a counter-irritant. If the patient has an aching and rheumatic joint, he is counselled to put some hot burning application on the skin, which smarts so agonizingly that the ache is quite extinguished. Metaphorically, Mr. Hopkins was Thermogene to Miss Mapp's outraged and aching consciousness, and the smart occasioned by the knowledge that Withers must have encouraged Mr. Hopkins, else he could scarcely have written a letter so familiar and amorous, and thus be contemplating matrimony, relieved the aching humiliation of all that had happened in the sea mist. It shed a new and lurid light on Withers. It made her mistress feel that she had nourished a serpent in her bosom, to think that Withers was contemplating so odious an act of selfishness as matrimony. It would be necessary to find a new parlour-maid, and all the trouble connected with that would not nearly be compensated for by being able to buy fish at a lower rate. That was the least that Withers could do for her. To insist that Mr. Hopkins should let her have dabs and plaice exceptionally cheap. And ought she tell Withers that she had seen Mr. Hopkins? No, that was impossible. She must write it, if she decided, for Withers' sake, to make this fell communication. Miss Mapp turned and tossed on her uneasy bed, and her mind went back to the Major and the Captain and that fiasco in the fog. Of course she was perfectly at liberty, having made her promise under practical compulsion, to tell everybody in Tilling what had occurred, trusting to the chivalry of the men not to carry out their counter-threat, but looking at the matter quite dispassionately. She did not think it would be wise to trust too much to chivalry. Still, even if they did carry out their unmanly menace, nobody would seriously believe that she had been drunk. But they might make a very disagreeable joke of pretending to do so, and, in a word, the prospect frightened her. Whatever Tilling did or did not believe, a residuum of ridicule would assuredly cling to her, and her reputation of having perhaps been the cause of the quarrel, which so happily did not end in a duel, would be lost for ever. Evie would speak. Quaint Irene would certainly burst into hoarse laughter when she heard the story. It was very inconvenient that honesty should be the best policy. Her brain, still violently active, switched off for a moment onto the eternal problem of the portmanteau. Why, so she asked herself for the 100th time, if the portmanteau contained the fatal apparatus of duelling, did not the combatants accompany it? And if, the only other alternative, it did not? An idea so luminous flashed across her brain that she almost thought the room had leaped into light. The challenge distinctly said that Major Benjy's seconds would wait upon Captain Puffin in the course of the morning. With what object, then, could the former have gone down to the station to catch the early train? There could be but one object, namely, to get away as quickly as possible from the dangerous vicinity of the challenged captain. And why did Captain Puffin leave that note on his table to say that he was suddenly called away, except in order to escape from the ferocious neighbourhood of his challenger? "The cowards!" ejaculated Miss Mapp. "They both ran away from each other. How blind I've been!" The veil was rent. She perceived how, carried away with the notion that a duel was to be fought among the sand dunes, Tilling had quite overlooked the significance of the early train. She felt sure that she had solved everything now, and gave herself up to a rapturous consideration of what use she would make of the precious solution. All regrets for the impossibility of ruining the character of Captain Puffin with regard to intoxicants were gone, for she had an even deadlier blacking to hand. No faintest hesitation at ruining the reputation of Major Benjy as well crossed her mind. She gloried in it, for he had not only caused her to deceive herself about the early hours on alternate nights, but by his infamous willingness to back up Captain Puffin's bargain, he had shown himself imperviously waterproof to all chivalrous impulses. For weeks now the sorry pair of them had enjoyed the spurious splendours of being men of blood and valour, when all the time they had put themselves to all sorts of inconvenience in catching early trains and packing bags by candlelight, in order to escape the hot impulses of quarrel that, as she saw now, were probably derived from drained whiskey bottles. That mysterious hollering about worm-casts was just another disagreement. And crowning rapture of all, her own position as cause of the projected duel was quite unassailed. Owing to her silence about drink, no one would suspect a mere drunken brawl. She would still figure as heroine, though the heroes were terribly dismantled. To be sure, it would have been better if their ardour about her had been such that one of them, at the least, had been prepared to face the ordeal. That they had not both preferred flight, but even without that she had much to be thankful for. "It will serve them both," said Miss Mapp, interrupted by a sneeze, for she had been sitting up in bed for quite a considerable time. "Right." To one of Miss Mapp's experience, the first step of her new and delightful strategic campaign was obvious, and she had spent hardly any time at all in the window of her garden-room after breakfast next morning but set out with her shopping basket at an unusually early hour. She shuddered as she passed between the front doors of her miscreant neighbours, for the chill of last night's mist and its dreadful memories still lingered there. But her present errand warmed her soul even as the tepid November day comforted her body. No sign of life was at present evident in those bibulous abodes. No ki-his had indicated breakfast, and she put her utmost irony into the reflection that the United Services slept late after their protracted industry last night over diaries and Roman roads. By a natural revulsion, violent in proportion to the depth of her previous regard for Major Benjy, she hugged herself more closely on the prospect of exposing him than on that of exposing the other. She had had daydreams about Major Benjy, and the conversion of these into nightmares annealed her softness into the semblance of some red-hot stone, giving vengeance a concentrated sweetness as of saccharin contrasted with ordinary lump sugar. This sweetness was so powerful a quality that she momentarily forgot all about the contents of Withers's letter on the kitchen table, and tripped across to Mr. Hopkins with an oblivious smile for him. "Good morning, Mr. Hopkins," she said. "I wonder if you've got a nice little dab for my dinner today. Yes? Will you send it up then, please? What a mild morning, like May." The opening move, of course, was to tell Diva about the revelation that had burst on her the night before. Diva was incomparably the best disseminator of news. She walked so fast, and her telegraphic style was so brisk and lucid, her terse tongue, her revolving feet, such a gossip. "Diva, darling, I had to look in a moment," said Elizabeth, pecking her affectionately on both cheeks. "Such a bit of news." "Oh, Contessa di Faradiglione," said Diva sarcastically. "I heard yesterday. Journey put off." Miss Mapp just managed to stifle the excitement which would have betrayed that this was news to her. "No, dear, not that," she said. "I didn't suspect you of not knowing that. Unfortunate, though, isn't it? Just when we were all beginning to believe that there was a Contessa di Faradiglione. What a sweet name! For my part, I shall believe in her when I see her. Poor Mr. Wyse." "What's the news, then?" asked Diva. "My dear, it all came upon me in a flash," said Elizabeth. "It explains the portmanteau and the early train and the duel." Diva looked disappointed. She thought this was to be some solid piece of news, not one of Elizabeth's ideas only. "Drive ahead," she said. "They ran away from each other," said Elizabeth, mouthing her words as if speaking to a totally deaf person who understood lip-reading. "Never mind the cause of the duel. That's another affair. But whatever the cause," here she dropped her eyes, "the Major, having sent the challenge, packed his portmanteau. He ran away, dear Diva, and met Captain Puffin at the station running away too." "But did—" began Diva. "Yes, dear. The note on Captain Puffin's table to his housekeeper said he was called away suddenly. What called him away? Cowardice, dear. How ignoble it all is. And we've all been thinking how brave and wonderful they were. They fled from each other and came back together and played golf. I never thought it was a game for men. The sand dunes where they were supposed to be fighting. They might lose a ball there, but that would be the utmost. Not a life. Poor Padre, going out there to stop a duel, and only finding a game of golf. But I understand the nature of men better now. What an eye-opener." Diva by this time was trundling away round the room, and longing to be off in order to tell everybody. She could find no hole in Elizabeth's arguments. It was founded as solidly as a Euclidean proposition. "Ever occurred to you that they drink?" she asked. "Believe in Roman roads and diaries? I don't." Miss Mapp bounded from her chair. Danger flags flapped and crimsoned in her face. What if Diva went flying round Tilling, suggesting that in addition to being cowards, those two men were drunkards? They would, as soon as any hint of the further exposure reached them, conclude that she had set the idea on foot, and then— "No, Diva darling," she said, "don't dream of imagining such a thing. So dangerous to hint at anything of the sort. Cowards they may be, and indeed are, but never have I seen anything that leads me to suppose that they drink. We must give them their due, and stick to what we know. We must not launch accusations wildly about other matters, just because we know they are cowards. A coward need not be a drunkard, thank God. It is all miserable enough as it is." Having averted this danger, Miss Mapp, with her radiant, excited face, seemed to be bearing all the misery very courageously, and as Diva could no longer be restrained from starting on her morning round, they plunged together into the maelstrom of the High Street, riding and whirling in its waters with the solution of the portmanteau and the early train for life buoy. Very little shopping was done that morning, for every permutation and combination of Tilling society, with the exception of course of the cowards, had to be formed on the pavement with a view to the amplest possible discussion. Diva, as might have been expected, gave proof of her accustomed perfidy before long, for she certainly gave the Padre to understand that the chain of inductive reasoning was of her own welding, and Elizabeth had to hurry after him to correct this grabbing impression. But the discovery in itself was so great that small false notes like these could not spoil the glorious harmony. Even Mr. Wyse abandoned his usual neutrality with regard to social politics, and left his tall malacca cane in the chemist's, so keen was his gusto on seeing Miss Mapp on the pavement outside, to glean any fresh detail of evidence. By 11 o'clock that morning the two duellists were universally known as the cowards, the Padre alone demurring, and being swampingly outvoted. He held, sticking up for his sex, that the Major had been brave enough to send a challenge, on whatever subject, to his friend, and had, though he subsequently failed to maintain that high level, shown courage of a high order, since for all he knew Captain Puffin might have accepted it. Miss Mapp was spokesman for the mind of Tilling on this too indulgent judgment. "Dear Padre," she said, "you are too generous altogether. They both ran away. You can't get over that. Besides, you must remember that, when the Major sent the challenge, he knew Captain Puffin, oh so well, and quite expected he would run away." "Then why did he run away himself?" asked the Padre. This was rather puzzling for a moment, but Miss Mapp soon thought of the explanation. "Oh, just to make sure," she said, and Tilling applauded her ready irony. And then came the climax of sensationalism, when at about 10 minutes past 11 the two cowards emerged into the High Street on their way to catch the 11:20 tram out to the links. The day threatened rain, and they both carried bags which contained a change of clothes. Just round the corner of the High Street was the group which had applauded Miss Mapp's quickness, and the cowards were among the breakers. They glanced at each other, seeing that Miss Mapp was the most towering of the breakers, but it was too late to retreat, and they made the usual salutations. "Good morning," said Diva, with her voice trembling. "Off to catch the early train together? I mean the tram?" "Good morning, Captain Puffin," said Miss Mapp with extreme sweetness. "What a nice little travelling bag. Oh, and the Major's got one too. A certain dismay looked from Major Flint's eyes. Captain Puffin's mouth fell open, and he forgot to shut it. "Yes, change of clothes," said the Major. "It looks a threatening morning." "Very threatening," said Miss Mapp. "I hope you will do nothing rash or dangerous." There was a moment's silence, and the two looked from one face to another of this fell group. They all wore fixed, inexplicable smiles. "It will be pleasant among the sand dunes," said the Padre, and his wife gave him a loud squeak. "Well, we shall be missing our tram," said the Major. Au reservoir, ladies." Nobody responded at all, and they hurried off down the street, their bags bumping together very inconveniently. "Something's up, Major," said Puffin, with true Tilling perspicacity, as soon as they had got out of hearing. Precisely at the same moment, Miss Mapp gave a little cooing laugh. "Now I must run and do my bitty shopping, Padre," she said, and kissed her hand all round. The curtain had to come down for a little while on so dramatic a situation. Any discussion just then would be an anticlimax. End of Chapter 8. Recording by Rhonda Fetterman.
Chapter 9.
Part 1 of Miss Mapp. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Miss Mapp by E. F. Benson.
Chapter 9.
Part 1.
Following so closely on the encounter with Miss Mapp last night, this irreverent attitude was probably due to some atheistical maneuver of hers. Such, at least, was the Major's view, and when he held a view he usually stated it, did Sporting Benjy. "We've got you to thank for this, Puffin," he said. "Upon my soul, I was ashamed of you for saying what you did to Miss Mapp last night. Utter absence of any chivalrous feeling, hinting that if she said you were drunk, you would say she was. She was as sober and lucid last night as she was this morning. She was devilish lucid, to my mind, this morning." "Pity you didn't take her part last night," said Puffin. "You thought that was a very ingenious idea of mine to make her hold her tongue." "There are finer things in this world, sir, than ingenuity," said the Major. "What your ingenuity has led to is this public ridicule. You may not mind that yourself, you may be used to it, but a man should regard the consequences of his act on others. My status in Tilling is completely changed for the worse, sir." Puffin emitted his fluty, disagreeable laugh. "If your status in Tilling depended on a reputation for bloodthirsty bravery," he said, "the sooner it was changed the better. We are in the same boat. I don't say I like the boat, but there we are. Have a drink, and you'll feel better. Never mind your status." "I've a good mind never to drink again," said the Major, pouring himself out one of his stiff little glasses, "if a drink leads to this sort of thing." "But it didn't," said Puffin. "How it all got out, I can't say. Nor, for the matter, can you. If it hadn't been for me last night, it would have been all over Tilling that you and I were tipsy as well. That wouldn't have improved our status, that I can see." "It was in consequence of what you said to Mapp," began the Major. "But, good Lord, where's the connection?" asked Puffin. "Produce the connection. Let's have a look at the connection." "There ain't any connection. Duelling wasn't as much as mentioned last night." Major Flint pondered this in gloomy, sipping silence. "Bridge party at Mrs. Poppet's the day after tomorrow," he said, "but I don't feel as if I could face it. Suppose they all go on making allusions to duelling and early trains and that. I shan't be able to keep my mind on the cards for fear of it. More than a sensitive man ought to be asked to bear." Puffin made a noise that sounded rather like fudge. "Your pardon," said the Major haughtily. "Granted, by all means," said Puffin, "but I don't see what you're in such a talking about. We're no worse off than we were before we got a reputation for being such fire-eaters. Being fire-eaters is a washout, that's all. Pleasant while it lasted, and now we're as we were." "But we're not," said the Major. "We're detected frauds. That's not the same as being a fraud. Far from it. And who's going to rub it in, my friend? Who's been rubbing away for all she's worth? Miss Mapp, to whom, if I may say so without offence, you behaved like a cur last night." "And another cur stood by and wagged his tail," retorted Puffin. This was about as far as it was safe to go, and Puffin hastened to say something pleasant about the hearth-rug, to which his friend had a suitable rejoinder. But after the affair last night, and the dark sayings in the High Street this morning, there was little content or coziness about the session. Puffin's brazen optimism was but a tinkling cymbal, and the Major did not feel like tinkling at all. He but snorted and glowered, revolving in his mind how to square Miss Mapp. Allied with her, if she could but be won over, he felt he could face the rest of Tilling with indifference, for hers would be the most penetrating shafts, the most stinging pleasantries. He had more, too, so he reflected, to lose than Puffin, for till the affair of the duel the other had never been credited with deeds of bloodthirsty gallantry, whereas he had enjoyed no end of a reputation in amorous and honourable affairs. Marriage no doubt would settle it satisfactorily, but this bachelor life, this plenty of golf and diaries, was not to be lightly exchanged for the unknown. Short of that, a light broke, and he got to his feet, following the gleam and walking very lame out of general discomfiture. "Tell you what it is, Puffin," he said, "you and I, particularly you, owe that estimable lady a very profound apology for what happened last night. You ought to withdraw every word you said, and every word that I didn't say." "Can't be done," said Puffin. "That would be giving up my hold over your lady friend. We should be known as drunkards all over the shop before you could say winky. Worse off than before." "Not a bit of it. If it's Miss Mapp, and I'm sure it is, who has been spreading these damaging rumours about our duel, it's because she's outraged and offended, quite rightly, at your conduct to her last night. Mine too, if you like. Ample apology, sir. That's the ticket." "Dog ticket," said Puffin. "No thanks." "Very objectionable expression," said Major Flint. "But you shall do as you like. And so, with your permission, shall I. I shall apologize for my share in that sorry performance, in which, thank God, I only played a minor role. That's my view, and if you don't like it, you may dislike it." Puffin yawned. "Mapp's a cat," he said. "Stroke a cat, and you'll get scratched. Shy a brick at a cat, and she'll spit at you and skedaddle. You're poor company tonight, Major, with all these squalms." "Then, sir, you can relieve yourself of my company," said the Major, "by going home." "Just what I was about to do. Good night, old boy. Same time tomorrow for the tram, if you're not too badly mauled." Miss Mapp, sitting by the hot water pipes in the garden-room, looked out not long after to see what the night was like. Though it was not yet 10:30, the coward sitting-rooms were both dark, and she wondered what precisely that meant. There was no bridge party anywhere that night, and apparently there were no diaries or Roman roads either. Why this sober and chastened darkness? The Major queried for his breakfast at an unusually early hour the next morning, for the courage of his resolve to placate, if possible, the hostility of Miss Mapp had not, like that of the challenge, oozed out during the night. He had dressed himself in his frock-coat, seen last on the occasion when the Prince of Wales proved not to have come by the 6:45, and no female breast, however furious, could fail to recognize the complement of such a formality. Dressed thus, with top hat and patent leather boots, he was clearly observed from the garden-room to emerge into the street just when Captain Puffin's hand thrust the sponge on to the window-sill of his bathroom. Probably he, too, had observed this apparition, for his fingers prematurely loosed hold of the sponge, and it bounded into the street. Wild surmises flashed into Miss Mapp's active brain, the most likely of which was that Major Benjy was going to propose to Mrs. Poppet, for if he had been going up to London for some ceremonial occasion, he would be walking down the street instead of up it. And then she saw his agitated finger press the electric bell of her own door. So he was not on his way to propose to Mrs. Poppet. She slid from the room and hurried across the few steps of garden to the house just in time to intercept Withers, though not with any idea of saying that she was out. Then Withers, according to instructions, waited till Miss Mapp had tiptoed upstairs and conducted the Major to the garden-room, promising that she would tell her mistress. This was unnecessary, as her mistress knew. The Major pressed a half-crown into her astonished hand, thinking it was a florin. He couldn't precisely account for that impulse, but general proprietation was at the bottom of it. Miss Mapp, meantime, had sat down on her bed and firmly rejected the idea that his call had anything to do with marriage. During all these years of friendliness he had not gone so far as that, and, whatever the future might hold, it was not likely that he would begin now at this moment, when she was so properly punishing him for his unchivalrous behaviour. But what could the frock-coat mean? There was Captain Puffin's servant picking up the sponge. She hoped it was covered with mud. It would be a very just continuation of his punishment to tell Withers she would not see him, but the punishment which that would entail on herself would be more than she could bear, for she would not know a moment's peace while she was ignorant of the nature of his errand. Could he be on his way to Padres to challenge him for that very stinging allusion to sand dunes yesterday? And was he come to give her fair warning so that she might stop a duel? It did not seem likely. Unable to bear the suspense any longer, she adjusted her face in the glass to an expression of frozen dignity, and threw over her shoulders the cloak trimmed with blue, in which, on the occasion of the prince's visit, she had sat down in the middle of the road, that matched the Major's frock-coat. She hummed a little song as she mounted the few steps to the garden-room, and stopped just after she had opened the door. She did not offer to shake hands. "You wish to see me, Major Flint," she said, in such a voice as icebergs might be supposed to use when passing each other by night in the Arctic seas. Major Flint certainly looked as if he hated seeing her, instead of wishing it, for he backed into a corner of the room and dropped his hat. "Good morning, Miss Mapp," he said. "Very good of you. I called." He clearly had a difficulty in saying what he had come to say, but if he thought that she was proposing to give him the smallest assistance, he was in error. "Yes, you called," said she. "Pray be seated." He did so. She stood. He got up again. "I called," said the Major, "to express my very deep regret at my share, or, rather, that I did not make a more active share. I followed, in fact, a friend of mine to speak to you in a manner that did equal discredit." Miss Mapp put her head on one side, as if trying to recollect some trivial and unimportant occurrence. "Yes," she said. "What was that?" "Captain Puffin," began the Major. Then Miss Mapp remembered it all. "I hope, Major Flint," she said, "that you will not find it necessary to mention Captain Puffin's name to me. I wish him nothing but well, but he and his are no concern of mine. I have the charity to suppose that he was quite drunk on the occasion to which I imagine you allude. Intoxication alone could excuse what he said. Let us leave Captain Puffin out of whatever you have come to say to me." This was adroit. It compelled the Major to begin all over again. "I come entirely on my own account," he began. "I understand," said Miss Mapp, instantly bringing Captain Puffin in again. "Captain Puffin, now I presume sober, has no regret for what he said when drunk. I quite see, and I expected no more and no less from him. Yes, I'm afraid I interrupted you." Major Flint threw his friend overboard like a ballast from a bumping balloon. "I speak for myself," he said. "I behaved, Miss Mapp, like a worm. Defenseless lady, insolent fellow drunk. I allude to Captain I'm very sorry for my part in it." Up till this moment Miss Mapp had not made up her mind whether she intended to forgive him or not, but here she saw how crushing a penalty she might be able to inflict on Puffin if she forgave the erring and possibly truly repentant Major. He had already spoken strongly about his friend's offence, and she could render life supremely nasty for them both, particularly Puffin, if she made the Major agree that he could not, if truly sorry, hold further intercourse with him. There would be no more golf, no more diaries. Besides, if she was observed to be friendly with the Major again and to cut Captain Puffin, a very natural interpretation would be that she had learned in the original quarrel that the Major had been defending her from some odious tongue to the extent of a challenge, even though he subsequently ran away. Tilling was quite clever enough to make that inference without any suggestion from her, but if she forgave neither of them, they would probably go on boozing and golfing together, and saying quite dreadful things about her, and not care very much whether she forgave them or not. Her mind was made up, and she gave a wan smile. "Oh, Major Flint," she said, "it hurt me so dreadfully that you should have stood by and heard that man, if he is a man, say those awful things to me and not take my side. It made me feel so lonely. I had always been such good friends with you, and then you turned your back on me like that. I didn't know what I had done to deserve it. I lay awake ever so long." This was affecting, and he violently rubbed the nap of his hat the wrong way. Then Miss Mapp broke into her sunniest smile. "Oh, I'm so glad you came to say you were sorry," she said. "Dear Major Benjy, we're quite friends again." She dabbed her handkerchief on her eyes. "So foolish of me," she said. "Now sit down in my most comfortable chair and have a cigarette." Major Flint made a peck at the hand she extended to him, and cleared his throat to indicate emotion. It really was a great relief to think that she would not make awful allusions to duels in the middle of bridge parties. "And since you feel as you do about Captain Puffin," she said, "of course you won't see anything more of him. You and I are quite one, aren't we, about that? You have dissociated yourself from him completely. The fact of your being sorry does that." It was quite clear to the Major that this condition was involved in his forgiveness, though that fact, so obvious to Miss Mapp, had not occurred to him before. Still, he had to accept it, or go on house-let again. He could explain to Puffin, under cover of night, or perhaps in deaf and dumb alphabet from his window. "Infamous, unforgivable behaviour," he said. "Pah!" "So glad you feel that," said Miss Mapp, smiling till he saw the entire row of her fine teeth. "And oh, may I say one little thing more? I feel this. I feel that the dreadful shock to me of being insulted like that was quite a lovely little blessing in disguise. Now that the effect has been to put an end to your intimacy with him. I never liked it, and I liked it less than ever the other night. He's not a fit friend for you. Oh, I'm so thankful." End of Chapter 9, Part 1. Recording by Captain Allegra.
Of Miss Mapp. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Miss Mapp by E. F. Benson. Chapter 9, Part 2. Major Flint saw that for the present he was irrevocably committed to this clause in the Treaty of Peace. He could not face seeing it torn up again, as it certainly would be, if he failed to accept it in its entirety, nor could he imagine himself leaving the room with a renewal of hostilities. He would lose his game of golf today as it was, for apart from the fact that he would scarcely have time to change his clothes, the idea of playing golf in a frock-coat and top-hat was inconceivable, and catch the 11:20 tram. He could not be seen in Puffin's company at all. And indeed, in the future, unless Puffin could be induced to apologize and Miss Mapp to forgive, he saw, if he was to play golf at all with his friend, that endless deceptions and subterfuges were necessary in order to escape detection. One of them would have to set out 10 minutes before the other, and walk to the tram by some unusual and circuitous route. They would have to play in a clandestine and furtive manner, parting company before they got to the club-house. Disguises might be needed. There was a peck of difficulties ahead. But he would have to go into these later. At present he must be immersed in the rapture of his forgiveness. "Most generous of you, Miss Elizabeth," he said. "As for that, well, I won't allude to him again." Miss Mapp gave a happy little laugh, and having made a further plan, switched away from the subject of captains and insults with alacrity. "Look," she said, "I found these little rosebuds in flower still, though it is the end of November. Such brave little darlings, aren't they? One for your buttonhole, Major Benjy? And then I must do my little shoppings, or Withers will scold me. Withers is so severe with me, keeps me in such order. If you are going into the town, will you take me with you? I will put on my hat." Requests for the present were certainly commands, and 2 minutes later they set forth. Luck, as usual, befriended ability, for there was Puffin at his door, itching for the Major's return, else they would miss the tram, and lo! there came stepping along Miss Mapp in her blue-trimmed cloak, and the Major attired as for marriage, top-hat, frock-coat, and buttonhole. She did not look at Puffin and cut him, she did not seem, with the deceptiveness of appearances, to see him at all, so eager and agreeable was her conversation with her companion. The Major, so Puffin thought, attempted to give him some sort of dazed and hunted glance, but he could not be certain even of that. So swiftly had it to be transformed into a genial interest in what Miss Mapp was saying, and Puffin stared open-mouthed after them, for they were terrible as an army with banners. Then Diva, trundling swiftly out of the fish-shop, came, as well she might, to a dead halt, observing this absolutely inexplicable phenomenon. "Good morning, Diva darling," said Miss Mapp. "Major Benjy and I are doing our little shopping together. So kind of him, isn't it? And very naughty of me to take up his time. I told him he ought to be playing golf. Such a lovely day. Au reservoir, sweet. Oh, and there's the Padre, Major Benjy. How quickly he walks. Yes, he sees us. And there's Mrs. Poppit. Everybody is enjoying the sunshine. What a beautiful fur coat, though I should think she found it very heavy and warm. Good morning, dear Susan. You shopping too, like Major Benjy and me? How is your dear Isabel?" Miss Mapp made the most of that morning. The magnanimity of her forgiveness earned her incredible dividends. Up and down the High Street she went, with Major Benjy in attendance, buying grocery, stationery, gloves, eau de cologne, boot laces, the literary supplement of the Times, dried chamomile flowers, and every conceivable thing that she might possibly need in the next week, so that her shopping might be as protracted as possible. She allowed him, such was her firmness in spoiling him, to carry her shopping basket, and when that was full, she decked him like a sacrificial ram with little parcels hung by loops of string. Sometimes she took him into a shop in case there might be someone there who had not seen him yet on her leash. Sometimes she left him on the pavement in a prominent position, marking all the time, just as if she had been a clinical thermometer, the feverish curiosity that was burning in Tilling's veins. Only yesterday she had spread the news of his cowardice broadcast. Today their comradeship was of the chattiest and most genial kind. There he was, carrying her basket, and wearing frock coat and top hat and hung with parcels like a Christmas tree, spending the entire morning with her instead of golfing with Puffin. Miss Mapp positively shuddered as she tried to realise what her state of mind would have been if she had seen him thus coupled with Diva. She would have suspected, rightly in all probability, some loathsome intrigue against herself. And the cream of it was that until she chose, nobody could possibly find out what had caused this metamorphosis so paralysing to inquiring intellects, for Major Benjy would assuredly never tell anyone that there was a reconciliation, due to his apology for his rudeness, when he had stood by and permitted an intoxicated Puffin to suggest disgraceful bargains. Tilling, poor Tilling, would go crazy with suspense as to what it all meant. Never had there been such a shopping. It was nearly lunch-time when, at her front door, Major Flint finally stripped himself of her parcels and her companionship and hobbled home, profusely perspiring, and lame from walking so much on pavements in tight patent leather shoes. He was weary and footsore, he had had no golf, and though forgiven, was but a wreck. She had made him ridiculous all the morning, with his frock coat and top hat and his porterages, and if forgiveness entailed any more of these nightmare sacraments of friendliness, he felt that he would be unable to endure the fatiguing accessories of the regenerate state. He hung up his top hat and wiped his wet and throbbing head. He kicked off his shoes and shed his frock coat, and furiously ki-hied for a whisky and soda and lunch. His physical restoration was accompanied by a quickening of dismay at the general prospect. What, to put it succinctly, was life worth, even when unharassed by allusions to duels, without the solace of golf, quarrels, and diaries in the companionship of Puffin? He hated Puffin, no one more so, but he could not possibly get on without him, and it was entirely due to Puffin that he had spent so outrageous a morning, for Puffin, seeking to silence Miss Mapp by his intoxicated bargain, had been the prime cause of all this misery. He could not even, for fear of that all-seeing eye in Miss Mapp's garden-room, go across to the house of the unforgiven sea captain, and by a judicious recital of his woes induce him to beg Miss Mapp's forgiveness instantly. He would have to wait till the kindly darkness fell. Mere slavery! He exclaimed with passion. A tap at his sitting-room door interrupted the chain of these melancholy reflections, and his permission to enter was responded to by Puffin himself. The Major bounced from his seat. "You mustn't stop here," he said in a low voice, as if afraid that he might be overheard. "Miss Mapp might have seen you come in." Puffin laughed shrilly. "Why, of course she did," he gaily assented. "She was at her window all right. Ancient Lights, I shall call her. What's this all about now?" "You must go back," said Major Flint agitatedly. "She must see you go back. I can't explain now, but I'll come across after dinner when it's dark. Go, don't wait." He positively hustled the mystified Puffin out of the house, which had grown sharp and pointed with doubts and suspicions when she observed him enter Major Benjy's house, dimpled as she saw him return, into the sunniest smiles. "Dear Major Benjy," she said, "he has refused to see him," and she cut the string of the large cardboard box which had just arrived from the dyer's with the most pleasurable anticipations. Well, it was certainly very magnificent, and Miss Greele was quite right, for there was not the faintest tinge to show that it had originally been kingfisher blue. She had not quite realised how brilliant Crimson Lake was in the piece, and it seemed almost to cast a ruddy glow on the very ceiling, and the fact that she had caused the orange chiffon with which the neck and sleeves were trimmed to be dyed black, following the exquisite taste of Mrs. Titus Trout, only threw the splendour of the rest into more dazzling radiance. Kingfisher blue would appear quite ghostly and corpse-like in its neighbourhood, and painful though that would be for Diva, it would, as all her well-wishers must hope, be a lesson to her not to indulge in such garishness. She should be taught her lesson, D.V., thought Miss Mapp, at Susan's bridge party tomorrow evening. Captain Puffin was being taught a lesson too, for we are never too old to learn, or, for that matter, to teach. Though the night was dark and moonless, there was an inconveniently brilliant gas lamp close to the Major's door, and that strategist, carrying his round roll of diaries, much the shape of a bottle, under his coat, went about 9:30 that evening to look at the rain gutter which had been weeping into his yard, and let himself out of the back door round the corner. From there he went down past the fishmonger's, crossed the road, and doubled back again up to Puffin's side of the street, which was not so vividly illuminated, though he took the precaution of making himself little with bent knees, and of limping. Puffin was already warming himself over the fire and imbibing Roman roads, and was disposed to be hilarious over the Major's shopping. "But why top hat and frock coat, Major?" he asked. "Another visit of the Prince of Wales, I asked myself, or the voice that breathed o'er Eden? Have a drink, one of mine, I mean. I owe you a drink for the good laugh you gave me." Had it not been for this generosity and the need of getting on the right side of Puffin, Major Flint would certainly have resented such clumsy levity, but this double consideration caused him to take it with unwonted good humour. His attempt to laugh, indeed, sounded a little hollow, but that is the habit of self-directed merriment. "Well, I allow it must have seemed amusing," he said. "The fact was that I thought she would appreciate my putting a little ceremony into my errand of apology, and then she whisked me off shopping before I could go and change." "Kiss and friends again, then?" asked Puffin. The Major grew a little stately over this. "No such familiarity passed," he said, "but she accepted my regrets with the most gracious generosity. A fine-spirited woman, sir. You'll find the same." "I might, if I looked for it," said Puffin, "but why should I want to make it up? You've done that, and that prevents her talking about duelling and early trams. She can't mock at me because of you. You might pass me back my bottle, if you've taken your drink." The Major reluctantly did so. "You must please yourself, old boy," he said. "It's your business, and no one's ever said that Benjy Flint interfered in another man's affairs. But I trust you will do what good feeling indicates. I hope you value our jolly games of golf and our pleasant evenings sufficiently highly." "Eh? How's that?" asked Puffin. "You going to cut me, too?" The Major sat down and put his large feet on the fender. "Tact and diplomacy, Benjy, my boy," he reminded himself. "Ha! That's what I like," he said. "A good fire and a friend, and the rest of the world may go hang. There's no question of cutting, old man, I needn't tell you that. But we must have one of our good talks. For instance, I very unceremoniously turned you out of my house this afternoon, and I owe you an explanation of that. I'll give it to you in one word. Miss Mapp saw you come in. She didn't see me come in here this evening, ha, ha, and that's why I can sit at my ease. But if she knew—" Puffin guessed. "What has happened, Major, is that you've thrown me over for Miss Mapp," he observed. "No, sir, I have not," said the Major with emphasis. "Should I be sitting here and drinking your whisky if I had? But this morning, after that lady had accepted my regret for my share in what occurred the other night, she assumed that since I condemned my own conduct unreservedly, I must equally condemn yours. It really was like a conjuring trick. The thing was over before I knew anything about it. And before I'd had time to say, 'Hold on a bit,' I was being led up and down the High Street, carrying as much merchandise as a drove of camels. God, sir, I suffered this morning. You don't seem to realise that I suffered. I couldn't stand any more mornings like that. I haven't the stamina." "A powerful woman," said Puffin reflectively. "You may well say that," observed Major Flint. "That is finely said. A powerful woman she is, with a powerful tongue, and able to be powerful nasty, and if she sees you and me on friendly terms again, she'll turn the full hose on to us both, unless you make it up with her." Yes. But likely as not she'll tell me and my apologies to go hang." "Have a try, old man," said the Major encouragingly. Puffin looked at his whisky bottle. "Help yourself, Major," he said. "I think you'll have to help me out, you know. Go and interview her. See if there's any chance of my favourable reception." "No, sir," said the Major firmly. "I will not run the risk of another morning's shopping in the High Street." "You needn't. Watch till she comes back from her shopping tomorrow." Major Benjy clearly did not like the prospect at all, but Puffin grew firmer and firmer in his absolute refusal to lay himself open to rebuff, and presently they came to an agreement that the Major was to go on his ambassadorial errand next morning. That being settled, the still undecided point about the worm cast gave rise to a good deal of heat, until, it being discovered that the window was open, and that their voices might easily carry as far as the garden-room, they made malignant rejoinders to each other in whispers. But it was impossible to go on quarrelling for long in so confidential a manner, and the disagreement was deferred to a more convenient occasion. It was late when the Major left, and after putting out the light in Puffin's hall, so that he should not be silhouetted against it, he slid into the darkness, and reached his own door by a subtle detour. Miss Mapp had a good deal of division of her swift mind, when, next morning, she learned the nature of Major Benjy's second errand. If she, like Mr. Wyse, was to encourage Puffin to hope that she would accept his apologies, she would be obliged to remit all further punishment of him, and allow him to consort with his friend again. It was difficult to forgo the pleasure of his chastisement, but, on the other hand, it was just possible that the Major might break away, and whether she liked it or not, and she would not, refuse permanently to give up Puffin's society. That would be awkward, since she had publicly paraded her reconciliation with him. What further inclined her to clemency was that this very evening the crimson lake tea-gown would shed its effulgence over Mrs. Poppit's bridge party, and Diva would never want to hear the word Kingfisher again. That was enough to put anybody in a good temper. So the diplomatist returned to the miscreant with the glad tidings that Miss Mapp would hear his supplication with a favourable ear, and she took up a stately position in the garden-room, which she selected as audience-chamber, near the bell so that she could ring for Withers if necessary. Miss Mapp's mercy was largely tempered with justice, and she proposed, in spite of the leniency which she would eventually exhibit, to give Puffin what for first. She had not for him, as for Major Benjy, that feminine weakness which made it a positive luxury to forgive him. She never even thought of Puffin as Captain Dicky, far less let the pretty endearment slip off her tongue accidentally, and the luxury which she anticipated from the interview was that of administering a quantity of hard slaps. She had appointed 12:30 as the hour for his suffering, so that he must go without his golf again. She put down the book she was reading when he appeared, and gazed at him stonily without speech. He limped into the middle of the room. This might be forgiveness, but it did not look like it, and he wondered whether she had got him here on false pretences. "Good morning," said he. Miss Mapp inclined her head. Silence was gold. "I understood from Major Flint," began Puffin. Speech could be gold too. "If," said Miss Mapp, "you have come to speak about Major Flint you have wasted your time, and mine." How different from Major Benjy, she thought. What a shrimp! The shrimp gave a slight gasp. The thing had got to be done, and the sooner he was out of range of this powerful woman the better. "I am extremely sorry for what I said to you the other night," he said. "I am glad you are sorry," said Miss Mapp. "I offer you my apologies for what I said," continued Puffin. The whip whistled. "When you spoke to me on the occasion to which you refer," said Miss Mapp, "I saw of course at once that you were not in a condition to speak to anybody. I instantly did you that justice, for I am just to everybody. I paid no more attention to what you said than I should have paid to any tipsy vagabond in the slums. I dare say you hardly remember what you said, so that before I hear your expression of regret I will remind you of it. You threatened, unless I promised to tell nobody in what a disgusting condition you were, to say that I was tipsy. Elizabeth Mapp, tipsy! That was what you said, Captain Puffin." Captain Puffin turned extremely red. Now the shrimp's being boiled, thought Miss Mapp. "I can't do more than apologise," said he. He did not know whether he was angrier with his ambassador or her. "Did you say you couldn't do more?" said Miss Mapp with an air of great interest. "How curious! I should have thought you couldn't have done less." "Well, what more can I do?" asked he. "If you think," said Miss Mapp, "that you hurt me by your conduct that night, you are vastly mistaken. And if you think you can do no more than apologise, I will teach you better. You can make an effort, Captain Puffin, to break with your deplorable habits, to try to get back a little of the self-respect, if you ever had any, which you have lost. You can cease trying, oh so unsuccessfully, to drag Major Benjy down to your level. That's what you can do." She let these withering observations blight him. "I accept your apologies," she said. "I hope you will do better in the future, Captain Puffin, and I shall look anxiously for signs of improvement. We will meet with politeness and friendliness when we are brought together, and I will do my best to wipe all remembrance of your tipsy impertinence from my mind. And you must do your best too. You're not young, and ingrained habits are difficult to get rid of. But do not despair, Captain Puffin. And now I will ring for Withers and she will show you out." She rang the bell, and gave a sample of her generous oblivion. "And we meet, do we not, this evening at Mrs. Poppit's?" she said, looking not at him, but about a foot above his head. "Such pleasant evenings one always has there. I hope it will not be a wet evening, but the glass is sadly down. Oh, Withers, Captain Puffin is going. Good morning, Captain Puffin. Such a pleasure." Miss Mapp hummed a rollicking little tune as she observed him totter down the street. "There," she said, and had a glass of Burgundy for lunch as a treat. Chapter 10 One of Miss Mapp. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Miss Mapp by E. F. Benson. Chapter 10, Part 1. The news that Mr. Wyse was to be of the party that evening at Mrs. Poppit's, and was to dine there first, en famille, as he casually let slip in order to air his French, created a disagreeable impression that afternoon in Tilling. It was not usual to do anything more than have a tray for your evening meal, if one of these winter bridge parties followed, and there was, to Miss Mapp's mind, a deplorable tendency to ostentation in this dinner-giving before a party. Still, if Susan was determined to be extravagant, she might have asked Miss Mapp as well, who resented this want of hospitality. She did not like, either, this hole-and-corner en famille work with Mr. Wyse. It indicated a pushing familiarity to which, it was hoped, Mr. Wyse's eyes were open. There was another point. The party, it had been ascertained, would in all number 10, and if, as was certain, there would be 2 bridge tables, that seemed to imply that 2 people would have to sit out. There were often 9 at Mrs. Poppit's bridge parties; she appeared to be unable to count, but on those occasions Isabel was generally told by her mother that she did not care for bridge, and so there was no cutting out, but only a pleasant book for Isabel. But what would be done with 10? It was idle to hope that Susan would sit out; as hostess she always considered it part of her duties to play solidly the entire evening. Still, if the cutting of cards malignantly ordained that Miss Mapp was ejected, it was only reasonable to expect that after her magnanimity to the United Services, either Major Benjy or Captain Puffin would be so obdurate in his insistence that she must play instead of him, that it would be only ladylike to yield. She did not, therefore, allow this possibility to dim the pleasure she anticipated from the discomfiture of darling Diva, who would be certain to appear in the kingfisher blue tea-gown, and find herself ghastly and outshone by the crimson lake which was the colour of Mrs. Trout's second toilette, and Miss Mapp, after prolonged thought as to her most dramatic moment of entrance in the crimson lake, determined to arrive when she might expect the rest of the guests to have already assembled. She would risk, it is true, being out of a rubber for a while, since bridge might have already begun, but play would have to stop for a minute of greetings, while she came in, and she would beg everybody not to stir, and would seat herself quite close to Diva, and openly admire her pretty frock, "like one I used to have." It was, therefore, not much lacking of 10 o'clock when, after she had waited a considerable time on Mrs. Poppit's threshold, Boone sulkily allowed her to enter, but gave no answer to her timid inquiry of "Am I very late, Boone?" The drawing-room door was a little ajar, and as she took off the cloak that masked the splendour of the crimson lake, her acute ears heard the murmur of talk going on, which indicated that bridge had not yet begun, while her acute nostrils detected the faint but certain smell of roast grouse, which showed what Susan had given Mr. Wyse for dinner, probably telling him that the birds were a present to her from the shooting lodge where she had stayed in the summer. Then, after she had thrown herself a glance in the mirror, and put on her smile, Boone preceded her, slightly shrugging his shoulders, to the drawing-room door, which he pushed open, and grunted loudly, which was his manner of announcing a guest. Miss Mapp went tripping in, almost at a run, to indicate how vexed she was with herself for being late, and there, just in front of her, stood Diva, dressed not in kingfisher blue at all, but in the crimson lake of Mrs. Trout's second toilette. Perfidious Diva had had her dress dyed too! Miss Mapp's courage rose to the occasion. Other people, majors and tipsy captains, might be cowards, but not she. Twice now, omitting the matter of the Wars of the Roses, had Diva, by some cunning, which it was impossible not to suspect of a diabolical origin, clad her odious little roundabout form in splendours identical with Miss Mapp's, but now, without faltering even when she heard Evie's loud squeak, she turned to her hostess, who wore the Order of MBE on her ample breast, and made her salutations in a perfectly calm voice. "Dear Susan, don't scold me for being so late," she said, "though I know I deserve it. So sweet of you. Isabel, darling, and dear Evie. Oh, and Mr. Wyse. Sweet Irene. Major Benjy and Captain Puffin. Had a nice game of golf. And the Padre." She hesitated a moment, wondering if she could, without screaming or scratching, seem aware of Diva's presence. Then she soared, lambent as flame. "Diva, darling," she said, and bent and kissed her, even as St. Stephen in the moment of martyrdom prayed for those who had stoned him. Flesh and blood could not manage more, and she turned to Mr. Wyse, remembering that Diva had told her that Contessa Faradiddleony's arrival was postponed. "And your dear sister has put off her journey, I understand," she said. "Such a disappointment. Shall we see her at Tilling at all, do you think?" Mr. Wyse looked surprised. "Dear lady," he said, "you're the second person who has said that to me. Mrs. Plaistow asked me just now—" "Yes, it was she who told me," said Miss Mapp, in case there was a mistake. "Isn't it true?" "Certainly not. I told my housekeeper that the Contessa's maid was ill and would follow her, but that's the only foundation I know of for this rumour. Amelia encourages me to hope she will be here early next week." "Oh, no doubt that's it," said Miss Mapp in an aside so that Diva could hear. "Darling Diva's always getting hold of the most erroneous information. She must have been listening to servants' gossip. So glad she's wrong about it." Mr. Wyse made one of his stately inclinations of the head. "Amelia will regret very much not being here tonight," he said, "for I see all the great bridge players are present." "Oh, Mr. Wyse," said she, "we shall all be humble learners compared with the Contessa, I expect." "Not at all," said Mr. Wyse, "but what a delightful idea of yours and Mrs. Plaistow's to dress alike in such lovely gowns. Quite like sisters." Miss Mapp could not trust herself to speak on this subject, and showed all her teeth, not snarling, but amazingly smiling. She had no occasion to reply, however, for Captain Puffin joined them, eagerly deferential. "What a charming surprise you and Mrs. Plaistow have given us, Miss Mapp," he said, "in appearing again in the same beautiful dresses. Quite like—" Miss Mapp could not bear to hear what she and Diva were like, and wheeled about, passionately regretting that she had forgiven Puffin. This manoeuvre brought her face to face with the Major. "Upon my word, Miss Elizabeth," he said, "you look magnificent tonight." He saw the light of fury in her eyes, and guessed, mere man as he was, what it was about. He bent to her and spoke low. "But, by Jove," he said with supreme diplomacy, "somebody ought to tell our good Mrs. Plaistow that some women can wear a wonderful gown, and others— Ha!" "Dear Major Benjy," she said. "Cruel of you to poor Diva." But instantly her happiness was clouded again, for the Padre had a very ill-inspired notion. "What ho! Fair Madame Plaistow," he humorously observed to Miss Mapp. "Ah, peccavi, I am in error. It is Mistress Mapp. But let us to the cards. Our hostess craves thy presence at yon table." Contrary to custom, Mrs. Poppit did not sit firmly down at a table, nor was Isabel told that she had an invincible objection to playing bridge. Instead, she bade everybody else take their seats, and said that she and Mr. Wyse had settled at dinner that they very much preferred looking on and learning to playing. With a view to enjoying this incredible treat as fully as possible, they at once seated themselves on a low sofa at the far end of the room, where they could not look or learn at all, and engaged in conversation. Diva and Elizabeth, as might have been expected from the malignant influence which watched over their attire, cut in at the same table, and were partners, so that they had, in spite of the deadly antagonism of identical tea-gowns, a financial interest in common, while a further bond between them was the eagerness with which they strained their ears to overhear anything that their hostess and Mr. Wyse were saying to each other. Miss Mapp and Diva alike were perhaps busier when they were being dummy than when they were playing the cards. Over the background of each mind was spread a hatred of the other, red as their tea-gowns, and shot with black despair as to what on earth they should now do with these ill-fated pieces of pride. Miss Mapp was prepared to make a perfect chameleon of hers, if only she could get away from Diva's hue; but what if, having changed to, say, purple, Diva became purple too? She could not stand a third coincidence, and besides, she much doubted whether any gown that had once been of so pronounced a crimson lake could successfully attempt to appear of any other hue except perhaps black. If Diva died, she might perhaps consult Miss Greele as to whether black would be possible, but then if Diva died, there was no reason for not wearing crimson lake for ever, since it would be an insincerity, of which Miss Mapp humbly hoped she was incapable, to go into mourning for Diva just because she died. In front of this lurid background of despair moved the figures which would have commanded all her attention, have aroused all the feelings of disgust and pity of which she was capable, had only Diva stuck to Kingfisher blue. There they sat on the sofa, talking in voices which it was impossible to overhear, and if ever a woman made up to a man, and if ever a man was taken in by shallow artifices, they, thought Miss Mapp, are the ones. There was no longer any question that Susan was doing her utmost to inveigle Mr. Wyse into matrimony, for no other motive, not politeness, not the charm of conversation, not the low, comfortable seat by the fire, could possibly have had force enough to keep her for a whole evening from the bridge table. That dinner en famille, so Miss Mapp sarcastically reflected, what if it was the first of hundreds of similar dinners en famille? Perhaps when safely married, Susan would ask her to come to one of the family dinners, with a glassful of foam which she called champagne, and the leg of a crow which she called game from the shooting lodge. There was no use in denying that Mr. Wyse seemed to be swallowing flattery and any other form of bait as fast as they were supplied him. Never had he been so made up to since the day, now 2 years ago, when Miss Mapp herself wrote him down as uncapturable. But now, on this awful evening of Crimson Lake, it seemed only prudent to face the prospect of his falling into the nets which were spread for him. Susan, the sister-in-law of a Contessa! Susan, the wife of the man whose urbanity made all Tilling polite to each other! Susan, a Wyse of Whitechurch! It made Miss Mapp feel positively weary of earth. Nor was this the sum of Miss Mapp's mental activities, as she sat being dummy to Diva, for in addition to the rage, despair and disgust with which these various topics filled her, she had narrowly to watch Diva's play, in order at the end to point out to her with lucid firmness all the mistakes she had made, while with snorts and sniffs and muttered exclamations and jerks of the head and pulling out of cards and puttings back of them, while with snorts and sniffs and muttered exclamations and jerks of the head and pullings out of cards and puttings of them back with amazing assertions that she had not quitted them, she wrestled with the task she had set herself of getting 2 no trumps. It was impossible to count the tricks that Diva made, for she had a habit of putting her elbow on them after she had raked them in, as if in fear that her adversaries would filch them when she was not looking, and Miss Mapp, distracted with other interests, forgot that no trumps had been declared and thought it was hearts, of which Diva played several after their adversaries' hands were quite denuded of them. She often did that to make sure. 3 tricks, she said triumphantly at the conclusion, counting the cards and the cash below her elbow. Miss Mapp gave a long sigh, but remembered that Mr. Wyse was present. "You could have got 2 more," she said, "if you hadn't played those hearts, dear. You would have been able to trump Major Benjy's club and the Padre's diamond, and we should have gone out. Never mind, you played beautifully otherwise." "Can't trump when it's no trumps," said Diva, forgetting that Mr. Wyse was there. "That's nonsense. Got 3 tricks. Did go out. Did you think it was hearts? Wasn't." Miss Mapp naturally could not demean herself to take any notice of this. "Your deal, is it, Major Benjy?" she asked. "Me to cut?" Diva had remembered just after her sharp speech to her partner that Mr. Wyse was present, and looked towards the sofa to see if there were any indications of pained surprise on his face which might indicate that he had heard. But what she saw there, or to be more accurate, what she failed to see there, forced her to give an exclamation which caused Miss Mapp to look around in the direction where Diva's bulging eyes were glued. There was no doubt whatever about it. Mrs. Poppit and Mr. Wyse were no longer there. Unless they were under the sofa they had certainly left the room together and all together. Had she gone to put on her sable coat in this hot night? Was Mr. Wyse staggering under its weight as he fitted her into it? Miss Mapp rejected the supposition. They had gone to another room to converse more privately. This looked very black indeed, and she noted the time on the clock in order to ascertain, when they came back, how long they had been absent. The rubber went on its wild way, relieved from the restraining influence of Mr. Wyse, and when, 39 minutes afterwards, it came to its conclusion and neither the hostess nor Mr. Wyse had returned, Miss Mapp was content to let Diva muddle herself madly, adding up the score with the assistance of her fingers, and went across to the other table till she should be called back to check her partner's figures. They would be certain to need checking. "Has Mr. Wyse gone away already, dear Isabel?" she said. "How early!" "And 4 makes 9," muttered Diva, getting to her little finger. Isabel was dummy, and had time for conversation. "I think he has only gone with mamma into the conservatory," she said. "No more diamonds, partner?" to advise her about the orchids. Now the conservatory was what Miss Mapp considered a potting shed with a glass roof, and the orchids were one anemic odontoglossum, and there would scarcely be room besides that for Mrs. Poppit and Mr. Wyse. The potting shed was visible from the drawing room window, over which curtains were drawn. "Such a lovely night," said Miss Mapp. "And while Diva is checking the score, may I have a peep at the stars, dear? So fond of the sweet stars." She glided to the window, conscious that Diva was longing to glide too, but was preparing to quarrel with the Major's score, and took her peep at the sweet stars. The light from the hall shone full into the potting shed, but there was nobody there. She made quite sure of that. Diva had heard about the sweet stars, and for the first time in her life made no objection to her adversary's total. "You're right, Major Flint, 18 pence," she said. "Stupid of me. I left my handkerchief in the pocket of my cloak. I'll pop out and get it. Back in a minute. Cut again for partners." She trundled to the door and popped out of it before Miss Mapp had the slightest chance of intercepting her progress. This was bitter, because the dining room opened out of the hall, and so did the book cupboard with a window which dear Susan called her boudoir. Diva was quite capable of popping into both of these apartments. In fact, if the truants were there, it was no use bothering about the sweet stars any more, and Diva would already have won. There was a sweet moon as well, and just as baffled Miss Mapp was turning away from the window, she saw that which made her positively glue her nose to the cold window pane, and tuck the curtain in, so that her silhouette should not be visible from outside. Down the middle of the garden path came the two truants, Susan in her sables and Mr. Wyse close beside her with his coat collar turned up. Her ample form with the small round head on the top looked like a short funnelled locomotive engine, and he like the driver on the footplate. The perfidious things had said they were going to consult over the orchid. Did orchids grow on the lawn? It was news to Miss Mapp if they did. They stopped, and Mr. Wyse quite clearly pointed to some celestial object, moon or star, and they both gazed at it. The sight of two such middle-aged people behaving like this made Miss Mapp feel quite sick, but she heroically continued a moment more at her post. Her heroism was rewarded, for immediately after the inspection of the celestial object, they turned and inspected each other, and Mr. Wyse kissed her. Miss Mapp scriggled from behind the curtain into the room again. "Adelbaron," she said, "so lovely." Simultaneously Diva re-entered with her handkerchief, thwarted and disappointed, for she had certainly found nobody either in the boudoir or in the dining room. But there was going to be a sit-down supper, and as Boone was not there, she had taken a marron glacé. Miss Mapp was flushed with excitement and disgust, and almost forgot about Diva's gown. "Found your hanky, dear," she said. "Then shall we cut for partners again? You and me, Major Benjy. Don't scold me if I play wrong." End of Chapter 10, Part 1.